Uli this is both a fascinating talk and he's really helped us out in that we had a cancellation sort of late in the season for the speaker that we had originally scheduled to speak tonight. So we're very excited to have Uli here, both to hear about his work and also to have a speaker tonight. Uli is the new Director of Horticulture for NEBC, the Native Plant Trust, having just arrived here and taken on this position this winter in March. Yep. He's also a brand new member of NEBC. So that's great to have new botanical blood in the region. Prior to moving to Massachusetts, Uli was the curator of native flora at Brooklyn Botanic Garden for 15 years, and a very active member on the council of the Torrey Botanical Society. So very exciting to have someone with that skill set moving into the region and hopefully being able to recruit him into NEBC. He served on the council of Torrey for 8 years, with 3 years as the program chair and 3 years as field committee chair, organizing field trips and activities. And one of his professional goals is to strengthen the connections between field botany with public horticulture, and seeks to do so through his work in public gardens and through advocacy and public speaking, as we'll see tonight. And he'll be speaking on the New Jersey Pine Barrens at a glance, the ecology and beauty of the wildest place in New Jersey.
Thank you. So thank you all for joining me and for allowing me a last-minute opportunity to share some of my work and passions. And this talk is kind of a mishmash of a lot of things that hopefully will come through as my passion for this place and why it is particularly botanically interesting, some of the rare plant monitoring and kind of fun field trip work that we did through Torrey, and a few other sorts of things. So, and maybe just a sort of introductory. I don't know how many people have ever been to the Pine Barrens. It's a really fascinating place. So it comprises ecologically nearly 1.4 million acres in southern New Jersey, and it is very close to two major metropolitan areas, with Philadelphia to the west and New York City 35 miles away from, or 35 miles away from its northern borders. It's about 30% of the total land mass for New Jersey, and as you can see, really kind of tucked in around a lot of heavily developed and heavily disturbed and fragmented kinds of habitat. It also sits on top of 17 trillion gallons of fresh water, which is something that various municipalities, including Philadelphia, at various points had designs on to drain and drink up. But thankfully, that never happened. So if you look at it a little more detailed, the pinelands themselves were first designated as the United States' first World Bioheritage Site, and then following on the heels of that was the Pinelands Protection Act in 1979 that set up a framework for trying to conserve and protect the pinelands as a whole while still allowing some degree of development. So the Pinelands Commission has, I think, 7 members, 4 of which are appointed by the governor and 3 of which are elected. And so there are and have been lots of specific examples of politics creeping into decisions about what happens and what's allowed to happen within the boundaries of the pinelands. So you have a lot of mixed sort of things. You have a couple really good core areas of good forest, and then a lot of little townships and other sorts of special zoning and agricultural areas. From a sort of history standpoint, I wanted to kind of touch a little bit about just briefly on soils, because soils are so important to the kinds of plants that can grow there. And so this was an area that was never glaciated during the last glacial period, and that the southernmost end of the Wisconsin Glacier really went right through the middle of New York City and through Long Island, and that most of the sort of gravel and sand and so forth were deposited in between these sort of periods of regression and intergression of glaciers. Another fact that I also find pretty amazing is the amount of seaward regression during the height of the ice ages that you would have added nearly 50 miles of coastline further from what it is now. There are a lot of plants, and part of what I also want to talk about is a little bit about why it's so floristically interesting from a biogeography standpoint. You have a lot of species that reach their southernmost limits here, and a lot of them that reach their northernmost limits. There's some interesting questions there. From a geologic map, most of the green and orange sections here are all entirely beach and estuarine deposits. Oh, thank you. There you go. Beach and estuarine deposits, sand, silt, and clay. And the sort of coastal plain that squeezes in here is kind of, there's an inner coastal plain that all the river systems drain towards the Delaware, and an outer coastal plain where everything drains out towards the Atlantic. And you can see the evidence of the glacier in the sort of striations in the northern part of the state. So I wanted to take a moment here, pause, and to give recognition to people who were really important for my growth as a botanist, and also talk a little bit about how I found myself to be doing science work at Brooklyn Botanic Garden. When I first arrived there in 2005, there was a robust program called the New York Metropolitan Flora Project, which was a long-term floristic project to try and look at how the flora of a major metropolitan region was changing over a long period of time. And as a sort of young horticulturalist, I was really interested in seeing native plants in context and using that information to be a better gardener, essentially. And so these people that I'm going to show you here were the ones that kind of took me under their wing and took me out and showed me where to find things and to sort of begin that whole trajectory and skill set. These are the very, let me back up for a minute. How many of you people know what happened to the science program at BBG? A handful of folks. So about 2009, the decision was made to shutter the program, and they fired all these people. And our herbarium is now at NYBG, and there's been no talk of ever resurrecting science since then. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to get out of Brooklyn, and why I'm so happy to be at a place that actually embraces and values botanical science. But so Paul, Carrie, having just fallen into a bog, but still happy, Carrie Berenger, Steve Glenn in a typical pose for a botanist, Gary Moore, who's now down at the USDA Plants Database in Greensboro, and some local folks like Ted Gordon. But those other four people were all kind of summarily let go, and so I found myself in a position where nobody was really doing any kind of work in terms of field work, and it was an opportunity for me to try to fill in that gap for a little bit, and that's partly what led me to doing this kind of work. So pine barrens are primarily a fire-adapted ecology where you have lots of natural blazes and more increasingly prescribed burns, and usually somewhere around a return cycle of every 5 to 8 years is what it should be. And there's an interesting kind of push and pull between whether you have pine-dominant areas or oak-dominated areas, depending on the frequency of the fires and the ability for that duff layer to really to build up. And so the more frequent the fires, the less duff there is, the more open area, and it favors pine seed germination. The deeper the duff layer, the less fires, you get more oaks to come in. And you really get kind of a patchwork of this happening throughout the areas. And there are a number of plants that really require this periodic disturbance in order to maintain open habitat, and particularly some of the rare plants. And we're also seeing declines in those because it's not from invasive species or any sorts of pressures, it's because they're getting succeeded out and shaded out. So one of the main species here is pitch pine, which has this wonderful ability to regenerate either from the crown or with epicormic shoots that are buried along the stem. And so if you have particularly severe fires like this one here in 2007, You come back the next year and you see all the next, it looks like a barren wasteland, and then within 2 weeks, the vegetation really just springs back. Increasingly, the Forest Service is now using prescribed burns to try to lessen the fuel load, because accidental fires do happen, and there are a lot of communities within the Pine Barrens, and so I think it's done more as a way to protect communities and less as a way to encourage regeneration. But you do get some interesting scenes, after with the charred grunks here, you get an almost monoculture of bracken ferns that comes in, sometimes some rather beautiful scenes in the fall with low bush blueberry coming in after the fires. And even in wetter areas where you get explosions of species like bushy broom sedge that tends to get kind of shaded out with less fire frequency. The vegetation kind of breaks down like this. Nearly half of it is dry upland areas where the water table is either anywhere from 3 feet to as low as 60 feet below ground. So a lot of the Pine Barrens, if you're just driving through, looks the same. It's like acres upon acres of pine or oak forest with an ericaceous understory. Some of the lowland ecosystems here too, about a quarter of that, and then wetlands and wetland ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems that fill in the rest of it. And these are the areas that are mostly botanically interesting. Although there are some good stuff back in here, but it's where water is present or where it's closer to the surface where you really get kind of explosions in diversity. So just some examples of some of these things. It's a pretty typical sand road. There aren't any good maps of all the sand roads, so it's really easy to get lost back in here unless you know where you're going. And oftentimes, one of the bigger threats to these two are also off-road guys that like to blast through here. They like to go through wetlands too, even though they're not supposed to, and they say they're creating habitat by tearing up wetlands. But especially after heavier rains, you can find pretty huge puddles, and you don't know how deep they are. And so you kind of have to be careful about blasting through with your truck. You can get stuck, or it can be very shallow. So a lot of these kinds of scenes with younger forests that are regenerating. Other areas where you have really tall, mature pitch pine forests. There are areas on the western edge where Pinus virginiana begins to creep in. And all of the pines, you've got Pinus rigida, Pinus echinata, Pinus virginiana are the most dominant three. And then just getting into the southern ends of it, you also pick up pond pine, Pinus serotina, and Pinus tiata loblolly as evidence of this kind of southern influence into the Pine Barrens. Where there are less frequent fire systems, you can see we're getting more of the oak. So there's pretty good oak diversity here. A lot of Quercus marylandica, ilicifolia, Prianus, Quercus alba, a great deal of oak diversity. So I also had, as you can tell, I'm kind of a clown when it comes to doing pictures. But I had a great opportunity to work on some Department of Defense lands in the Warren Grove National Guard bombing range with two great folks from Drexel University, Dr. Walter Bean and Marilyn Sobel. And so this place sits right in the middle of what's called the Pine Plains. And because it's a bombing range, they also have some sort of fake targets set up. And they routinely either do drone strikes or fighter jet strikes. They also roll tanks around here, so there is a certain degree of disturbance going on. And I don't know if anybody's ever done work on DoD lands. There's a whole waiver that you have to sign to make sure that you don't sue them if you step on unexploded ordnances. You're not allowed to pick up the 50 caliber shells and take them home. And, but this particular field here is actually one of the best sites for this plant, Pine Barrens gentians. There's probably about 10 to 15,000 of these growing, including some neat color forms as well. But so the Pine Plains is a particular region within the larger pines where the soil is so depauperate and the fires are so frequent that these trees don't grow more than 6, 7 feet tall. And they can be easily 40 or 50 years old. But I'm a 6-foot person, and you can see for literally hundreds of acres over the top of these kind of stunted, gnarly kinds of pine trees. And it's a really neat habitat that's very unusual from the other kinds of pine forests. One of their pilots accidentally dropped a flare back in 2007 that set off a big wildfire, but people were concerned. You come back a year later and it looks like nothing ever happened. We have other kinds of open or early successional habitats. This was a titanium mine where they had basically dumped a giant sand dune after they processed the sand, and it's a wonderful opportunity to see that early successional process happening. And it's also really close to where the Hindenburg crashed. So you can kind of stand up on the top of the dune and look over and see. And there's some neat stuff going on there. There's a lot of annual Aristida tuberculosa and Pidiopsis falcata, which is a rare plant up in New York, and I believe here as well, but in great abundance in this really early successional habitat. Lowland pine systems, which again I've always found really fascinating, that you can have the same species growing right next to water as well as growing in incredibly dry areas. So just some examples of that. And then where I really like to inhabit a lot of my times are in Atlantic white cedars, swamps, bogs, and these kind of graminoid savannas along the edges of these rivers, because that's where a lot of the really cool stuff is. Typical cedar swamps can look anything like the scene on the left, where there's a little bit open, or on the right, where there's a lot of stems per acre. So a great density, although very few of them actually make it to maturity. And because Atlantic white cedar is an important timber species, almost all of the old growth was cut down originally. And so nobody really knows what a real mature Atlantic white cedar swamp looks like. There are a few really remote pockets where you can find some of these things. And so back in this mess, and here is the current state champion, Chamaecyparis thyoides, here with Gary and a group from Torrey, and you can't even really see the top of this thing. And it took us probably about 2 hours of bushwhacking to get back to this tree. So a lot of neat things in there. There are one of the other sort of old growth areas that's left is a place called Bear Swamp, where you can find red maples of that size, along with really mature Nyssa that has lots of mistletoe up at the top. There's an area in this with Magnolia virginiana as a canopy species, also really massive ones. So a little taste of maybe what primeval pine barrens might have looked like. And then we have savanna sites and bog sites. This was an old bog iron facility that was named for the factory owner's wife. And it was active in the 1850s up until the maybe 1880s. And this was the site of the mill pond. So they had excavated it to make sure that they could use water power to drive the water wheels and fire the bellows. There's so much natural iron because of the acidity of this that you could make manhole covers and railroad ties. And this was one of the important industries at that time, along with glass making, that took place here. And then once the site was abandoned, this really beautiful kind of bog began to form over the next 100 years, and it is chock-a-block full of really wonderful rare plants. And it's one of the better kind of savanna sites. Here's another one here with Danthonia epilis and Lopheola. There's Triantha racemosa in here, different area colon species. Really wonderful sites that maybe at first glance don't look like there's a whole lot in there, but once you start getting into the details, there's quite a bit of diversity. And then just a few scenes of different streams and ponds. The west bank of the Wading River here, which a little bit off-site here, there's probably maybe 10,000 Aurantium aquaticum growing in here. It is a very common plant down there, not at all listed rare in any way, shape, or form. The Oswego again, kind of gently meandering around. And one of the sites that I do spend a good amount in South Jersey called Manymuskin, and most of what you see here is all wild rice. So that one's for you, Michael. So the area, because of its interest, has long had botanical relevance in that a number of type specimens were collected from this region, going back into the early 1800s, things like Narthecium lopheola, curly grass fern from Quaker Bridge by Frederick Persh in 1814, and all the way up into 1961 with the discovery of Panicum hurstii by Frank Hurst, and many of these also published in Rhodora by Fernald, by a couple other types of people. And what's wonderful is you can actually go back to these places and still see the same plants, and they've persisted here for such a long period of time. Narthecium here in Curtis magazine, and a great, wonderful description here, and some arguments about whether or not this should belong to Tophieldia or be a Narthecium itself, because there are European Nartheciums that they were familiar with, and this is a plant that I did a lot of monitoring work with. Lopheola, again here from Curtis, and it is one of the most bizarre looking plants, and absolutely wonderful, just sort of blue-green grassy foliage that you can see in here that erupt into this kind of Dr. Seuss looking flower. Very, very fuzzy, very tomentose, even cute after a rain, a little bit bedraggled. Skyzia here from Frederick Persh, and he notes here, you know, that, and this isn't quite correct because this plant is almost exclusively found in cedar swamps and right up on the hummocks of cedar swamps, so not in barren, sandy, moist ground. But the last little point here about it being so small to escape the notice of aboutness unless accident points it out, this is the kind of plant that you can look for, and when you realize you found it, you look around and you're standing in the middle of hundreds of them. What does it look like? It is, we'll get to it in a bit, but it's tiny. A lot of milkworts, a lot of polygolas. This is another one from down there. Platanthera integra, Stylisma picaringii. We worked with New Jersey Conservation Foundation a few years ago to make collections of all of the known, seed collections of all of the known populations of this plant. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do anything with it, but there are banks at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank right now for somebody else to do work with. Rexia from Egg Harbor, 1880, Rexia aristosa. And so this whole idea of like northern boreal floras and southern floras converging here is what makes this place so incredibly exciting. And if you look back into some of the older literature, there were a number of species that people thought were endemic to the Pine Barrens until we had a better understanding of these larger ranges. Only about 14 species of northern origin that reach their southern limits here, and then over 109 species of southern origin that reach their northern limits, along with some insects and butterflies as well. So here's curly grass fern. The whole plant is maybe 2 inches tall, maybe 3 inches, and it has this really interesting distribution where it's in New Jersey, and then you have to go to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland to see it again. And more recently, a station of this plant was discovered in Peru. No idea, I can't explain that, but you know, it's confirmed, it's there. And so, you know, whether this was something that was pushed down by the glaciation and then stayed there and was able to somehow disperse back up is an intriguing question. Here it is. I guess there's some in North Carolina as well. And that's it for scale with some sphagnum. So all you're looking for are those little curly leaves, if you can find it and not crush it. Conrad's crowberry is another example of this, Carima conradii, where there are areas that it forms almost an entire ground cover. You've got both pistillate and staminate flowers, and its distribution is equally odd, although the populations out on Long Island and in Ulster County here are gone. I don't know if there's any in Massachusetts. There are still some? Okay, that's good. Because these populations have both disappeared. But another one of northern origin, Eriophorum tenellum. There's a lot of cotton grasses in the north that just get down in here. And then we have the southern element, and there's an interesting split here between plants that are only found on the coastal plain in New Jersey and then skip over into the mountains in the further south. So Xerophyllum or turkey beard is one of these with a very strong affinity for the Appalachians. Liophyllum buxifolium, which you can find on the coastal plain, and I saw it at the top of Mount LeConte a few years ago in the Smokies. Polonius, that were also, some of you who came here early got to see it in bloom here. And then things that are a little more spread out, like Curtis's milkwort. There's only one station in New Jersey for Curtis's milkwort. Desmodium strictum. We're starting to see plants now that are coastal plain associates. Pine Barrens death camas, great name. Plant contains rotenone, which is a powerful rodenticide. It'll kill fish, it'll kill all sorts of stuff. Smilex laurifolia, Triantha racemosa, sickle leaf silkgrass, Pideopsis, Xyrus fimbriata. This was my intern a few years back, and we had discovered a new station for this in amongst what looked like it was all Carex walteri or striata. And she was really excited because it's an S1, and she's yes, so I can capture that. New Jersey rush, and so these are plants with a little more narrower, like mid-Atlantic distributions. This is a plant that I did quite a lot of work with. It's federally listed, Ascomyia virginica, sensitive joint vetch. I'm not even sure if this is still accurate. It's because it's an annual, its population numbers fluctuate, and we'll get to a little bit more information about that. Pixie moss, which is an absolutely delightful, charming little plant. And there's only one other species in North Carolina, Pyxidantha brevifolia. Pine Barrens boneset. Another federally listed plant that was once thought to be endemic, Lincospernice kearney, which is here growing with Xyrus torta, only in New Jersey and in southern Delaware. And then things like Muhlenbergia toriana, which when it's not blooming doesn't look particularly great, but when you find these whole areas of it, sort of sods of it, it can be absolutely gorgeous in the fall when it flowers. And we had an opportunity to go out with an entomologist from Natural History Museum in Colorado, and somebody who specialized on leaf hoppers who were specialists of Muhlenbergias. And so we took him out in the field for a week, and him with a sweep net, and took him to all of the populations of Muhlenbergia toriana that we could find. And it turns out that there's a whole brand new species to science that is only found here and only a specialist on this particular plant. And it's the kind of thing that, you know, again for me underlines why field work is important, that there are still new discoveries to be made out there and new relationships to uncover. So with the absence of the science department, the garden had a lot more interest in our relationships with the Center for Plant Conservation. And we had been a member for a long time, but the research focus of the science department prior to that had been really this floristic study. And so this was something that I thought I could take on to some extent. And I can also say that what is so fantastic about this region is the NEBC as a model for how to cover and get all of the different agencies together to work towards a common goal. And this is absolutely missing in the mid-Atlantic and desperately needs to happen. Ascomyia virginica, Schwalbia, and Rincosper are all federally listed species, which means there are recovery plans and people that are working on it, but nobody's talking to one another. And even Narthecium, which I spent a lot of time looking for, there were other folks doing the same stuff, and it would have been great to collaborate and join forces, but that networking is just not there. And so as much as I love getting out there, I also felt like I was kind of spinning my wheels a little bit without a real focus. So Narthecium was something that I tried to get to as many different populations as possible. It's where this one comes from Forked River. An absolutely beautiful site, full of lots of other things too. This is a little more typical for Narthecium, where it's kind of peppered in here in between along the banks of the Forked River itself. And then one of the best stations here is Webb's Mill Bog, with probably 100,000 stems easy. And this place has a boardwalk out into it. So, and that's great because you can bring people there, but it's sort of a known entity, so we're not really discovering a whole lot new about it. Matthew, I wanted to throw this picture into you as a fellow club moss enthusiast. Lots and lots of Lycopodiella pressa in these places, which is a wonderful little plant. So we got a new living collections director, and somebody who's a little more tech savvy, and he devised a sort of handheld, sort of phone-driven collection device using this program, which was initially meant for epidemiology data collection, but it's customizable, so you can do little sort of drop-down menus to answer sorts of questions, and it ties into the phone's GPS and camera, and so you can go out and collect a lot of basic field data very easily without having to fill in lots of forms and then enter the forms into a system later on. And this is what we did for some of the populations of Ascaniami virginica, which it lives right on the edges of the Manu-Muscien, which is a freshwater tidal system here. This is low tide, and this is what it looks like at high tide. And so if you want to do field work, you really want to be here because it's drier. You can get around. But the day that we were able to get out there, it was high tide. It is absolutely the most wild rice I've ever seen in my life. Probably 200 acres or more of it. And then this is the kind of place right on the edge where this plant inhabits. So we went down with one of my interns a few years back using the handheld device, and we were able to locate about 250 to 260 individual plants before we actually got completely soaked, because getting around and all the little inlets ended up being really difficult. But definitely worth it. Lots of other fun stuff in there too. Loads of things like spotted water hemlock and angelica. And it's a tough plant to spot. You really have to be almost on top of it. I took this picture just kind of like, here's a marsh habitat picture, and then looking at it a little bit closer, there's Ascaniami here, there's Ascaniami here, there's another plant right in here. So it really fades in, and because it's an annual, the populations fluctuate every year. And so it's a little hard to really be able to tell exactly how many individuals there are out there from one year to the next. It is an interesting plant in that the seeds require no stratification whatsoever. And I've grown it in our greenhouse, and it behaves like a weed. It grows 6 foot tall, makes lots of seed, so I'm thinking there might be some sort of competition issues with it in this habitat. The other issues are that as more and more storms batter southern New Jersey, salt water gets pushed further and further up the system, and the plants are kind of running out of space to move in advance of the salt. And this plant that we've tried to track down a lot of historical locations based on herbarium data. Almost all of them are gone or shaded out, and there's probably this is probably the last good place for this plant in the state of New Jersey. And so some years you have up to 10,000 plants, other years only a handful. So we did the same thing with pixie moss. This is just sort of a collage of all the different pixie moss plants that we found in one day. This plant, I think, is underreported because when it's not in flower, it just looks like a moss to the untrained eye. But I don't know anybody trying to do any kind of systematic surveys of this plant.
So that's Diapensiaceae, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So Schwalbia was one, again, it's kind of a sad story. There's one naturally occurring population left at White's Bog, and then they had conducted about 7 years ago a couple of outplantings, and some of those have done well, and this is the sort of site of one of these outplantings. It's like a roadside strip just beyond where it gets mowed. and yet it still persists, but the outlook for this plant is not great in New Jersey. And it's very exciting that it's been rediscovered here in Massachusetts. I think that's a really wonderful find. So my friend Gary Moore and I, through Torrey Botanical Society, set up over the course of 2 or 3 years trips into southern New Jersey to try to look at vernal ponds, and particularly ones that don't show up on regular topo maps. And so a lot of this required looking at maps like this and then overlaying it in Google Earth and saying, wait a minute, there's a gap in the forest there. Some of these are incredibly difficult to reach. You know, an hour to go 200 yards through greenbrier and shrub thickets, and not particularly easy going. But interesting because on drier years they can look like this, and in wetter years they can look like that. And that's the same spot. Some of these may have been former cranberry or blueberry operations that were abandoned deep in the woods at some point. But they're worth revisiting. And one of the better ones is this Big Goose Pond and Little Goose Pond in Egg Harbor City with some of my helpers here. And this is the place, and the only place in New Jersey where Rexia aristosa grows. And that's that sort of soft pink here out in the distance in here. And this was the same place that this was collected back in 1888. So these plants have persisted in this one place. They haven't really moved anywhere since then. And it's another great place to see other southern species like Panicum hemidamon coming up in great abundance. Halberton Pond was another one that we went to. And Halberton is the history of people in Pine Barrens is very much intertwined with the landscapes. And whether there are old bog iron facilities or other kinds of industrial facilities that were abandoned and have been reclaimed. This particular site here was one of the earliest Jewish agricultural colonies that were founded in the United States. And these were basically new immigrants that arrived into New York City with nothing and were said, hey, if you travel down to New Jersey, they've set up a couple of these different towns. And if you read into a little bit more, none of these were really successful agricultural communities because Pine Barrens is just an awful place to try to grow traditional kinds of crops. And so Halberton was one of these that was established late 19th century, and probably by 1910 was abandoned because nobody could squeeze any food out of the sand and earth that was there. It's a good place for things like Saccharum giganteum, other cranberry bogs that we found, and basically the point of these is that they were fruitful and that we did yield a number of new state and county records for Pine Barrens boneset, for purple bladderwort, Rhynchospora macrostachya, filifolia, and inundata, all new records for those plants. So, and then sometimes it's a little bit of a bust. And other times they're flooded and full of snapping turtles, so you can watch your step. But still have really cool plants like bog buttons with an * ACE number, which I also realized after I took the photo has some springtails on it, which is just pretty neat. So basically, the last thing I wanted to end with is this idea of people in the Pine Barrens, and that I think that the human history and the future of this landscape are really intertwined. There's the story of the New Jersey Devil. If anybody knows the story of the New Jersey Devil, is the story is that back in 1735, a Mrs. Leeds of Hamilton was about to give birth to her 13th child. Her husband was a drunkard and unsupportive, and she was having a hard time of it, and so she said, let this child be a devil. And when it emerged looking like this, with a horse's head, wings, cloven hooves, and a forked tail, and it burst through the window out into the swamp. And there have been numerous sightings since then, even up into modern times, where pets go missing or chicken coops are terrorized, and it becomes part of the lore of the place. Even the NHL team, the Jersey Devils, is named for this character. And I was always a big fan of the gazetteer maps. And so, and the New Jersey Gazetteer map is a pretty standard map, except on one page, with no explanation, tucked away in the corner of a big forest, there's a little Jersey Devil icon. Even the map makers know to like put this kind of stuff in here. You know, there's obviously other ephemera that you find, and you know, creepy dolls and things. Unfortunately, a lot of people see this wonderful landscape as a dumping ground because of the amount of little sand roads that are hidden away, and so this is a constant problem for people who care about it. There are other wonderful institutions here. The OVT being one of my favorite. That's Old Vineland Tavern, which was a frequent stop for us at the end of the field day. This place has no windows. All right, it just looks like a barn. There's no windows, and you can imagine what goes on inside. Lucille's Country Cooking in Warren Grove. This is a town close to the bombing range. There's not even a stoplight in the town, but the food is great. And Lucille Pickford, the owner, serves up a lot of sass along with it. She's the kind of lady that won't take trash from anyone. And then places like Mixed Canoe Rental, one of the best places to see, and best ways to see the Pine Barrens is to rent a canoe and float down one of the many streams, and it's like you have the whole place to yourself. It's a really wonderful way to do that. But I think that one of the other things that I take very seriously about field work, particularly whether it's in a public horticulture standpoint or through botanical societies, is that you have to share that and get as many people interested in it, particularly the next generation. And so I wanted to end with just a couple of scenes of BBG interns that we have taken out. We had a high school mentoring program where we took 14 and 15-year-olds and showed them what botanical work was like, and then took them out on a field trip. And so just as smiling faces is really what I think are people really having a wonderful experience and realizing that there's so much to uncover, so much to see. This was our development department. If you want your development people to raise money for you, take them out in the field. And what looks like a helicopter is actually a dragonfly. It's a perfect photo bomb. But you know, I was able to get, this is our like senior vice president, and the other, this woman here is the other vice president of development. These are people who never go out in the field, and all of them have consistently, even to this day, talk about how that was their best memory, and they were much more effective in raising money because they could draw from a personal experience in doing that. Here are two of our high school students. John told me that he wanted to grow up to be a mortician, and so I showed him bloodroot, and he thought that was really cool. And then when we went down the Pine Barrens, I showed him carnivorous plants, and I think he wants to be a botanist now, which is fantastic. So all sorts of people over the years, more shy teens that break out and smile, lots of seed collecting, you know, 15-year-olds not afraid to get into the water, intern groups after intern groups after intern groups. And so I feel really good in that sense of having exposed and hopefully turned on some of these young folks to the importance of field botany and valuing the natural world. So with that, I'll end it and say thank you and happy to answer any questions.
Is Lucille still open?
It is.
We went there when we had our field trip.
Yeah, they're only open from 7 to 3 p.m., so they don't do dinner. And unfortunately, Lucille herself has passed. She passed last year. But they sell the most delicious pecan pie and blueberry pies, and just the food is great. And it's a real kind of local place. And it's harder for me now to do that, but I was always made a point of getting back to Lucille's, because Warren Grove is known for a lot of neat stuff. The Karima site is just down the road from there. So, Bill?
You mentioned that 9 or so species reach their northern limit there. And
yes.
Are those species showing any retraction because of of climate change? Is that, are they species that are rare because of their
Yes, I mean, so like Karima, I think Karima it's not widely distributed, but there are a couple of spots where it is it's very abundant. Curly grass fern is another one that I think is more overlooked because of its diminutive size. But things like the Eriophorum tenellum are getting increasingly rare. There's other Eriophorums that kind of muscle it out, and I'm trying to think of what some of the other ones are, but they've been relatively secure for a long time there. So, but I mean, it remains to be seen. The sea level rise is certainly coming in, and that's beginning to impact some of the more coastal communities. Storms like Sandy too, that blow in a lot of salt and so forth. I mean, all these things are going to have impacts on those plants, but hard to say if there's any noticeable retractions in ranges.
They're doing a lot more prescribed fire in pretty large scales down there. Is that helping some of the floral diversity? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the main reason they do it is to reduce fuel load, because increasingly people are building deeper into the pines, and it's funny to see little square lots hacked out of the forest, and then they've got lawn and sprinkler systems and little traditional non-native meatballs all around, and like you guys have like this wonderful botanical richness in your backyard, and you just want to keep it at bay, and then that person there in that part of forest means that they're going to do whatever they need to protect those homes and industries from fire. There are increasingly more naturally occurring fires. We don't get as many lightning strikes as they do in the south, but they do occur, and then there's usually a mad scramble and lots of media coverage about hundreds of acres destroyed.
Right.
And I think to myself, no, it's all going to come back beautifully. So, but no, there's I think part of the problem, and this guy here, Emile DeVito, he's somebody who I think recognizes like a sense of urgency to begin doing things as opposed to just talking about doing things. And so he's definitely somebody who would rather, on conservation land, they're not huge landowners, but they do own a significant amount of property down there. They'll do prescribed burns for habitat purposes and not because it protects local communities. He initiated the collection of all of the stylosma sites because nobody's working with these plants. And if people are, like I said, the lack of a network, nobody really knows who's doing this and who's working on this. The Narthecium, for example, I spent a lot of years looking for new populations and did find some, and then last year a paper was published in Tory Journal of a 10-year effort by other folks that located a whole bunch more stuff, and we could have worked together on it. But so it's that kind of thing where people are kind of working in their own little silos and not talking to one another. And there's a great need for that because there's a lot of plants that could at least be banked or worked with down in this area.
Does that kind of individualized research carry over to the conservation mosaic you see in the Pine Barrens? Are large parcels owned by single entities, or is it?
Well, so part of it is also the state entity, Natural Heritage, doesn't seem to be willing to form lots of collaborations. And it's in stark contrast to, we worked with Steve Young at Natural Heritage in New York State, and they were wonderful in giving permits and allowing us to look for pixie and other things on the Long Island Pine Barrens, which are similar but not nearly as floristically diverse. And we had experiences even when the full complement of the science staff was there, where we collected a Dicanthelium rhydiane of an S3, and shared the data with Natural Heritage, and our permit came back the next year with an extra sentence that said we were not to collect hard to identify species without express written permission from the head of Natural Heritage.
Wow.
So that kind of thing is like, well, how, we took one plant for an herbarium specimen out of a whole, 500 plants. We're not ripping off the last one, and it just doesn't feel like the spirit of collaboration was really there. And so maybe it's just a personality thing. Maybe, people need to change. There just wasn't anybody able to kind of bring all the partners together in a constructive way, which is a shame because it's a really beautiful place. And there is good work being done there, but I think that this kind of work has limits in terms of resources, and pooling those I think is much more effective than people doing it piecemeal.
Are you familiar with Barbara Kingsolver's book on shelter?
No, I don't know that
Because I
one.
think that's her latest, and it's the historic part and then a contemporary part, but it's in a town in New Jersey.
Ah, okay.
And the historic part is very botanical and is about, is it Nuttall? Thomas Nuttall?
Not all, yeah.
Nuttall,
Yeah.
okay, who
Yeah,
worked
yes.
on that. So it spends a lot of the historic part in the Pine Barrens looking for plants. So
Yeah, there's,
it's interesting.
that's a good recommendation. There's a book by John McPhee called The Pine Barrens that's
Yeah.
also really good and talks a little bit about the history of the designs to put an airport there and to drain the aquifer. There's another guy called Dan Brown who wrote a book called Tracker, and it's him basically learning how to track animals and survive as a kid in the Pine Barrens. It's a wonderful read because he gets, he lived in the 50s down there, and he would get lost in the forest and get chased up trees by packs of wild dogs, and it's a wonderful, wonderful read, and also very botanical. So, if you're interested in historical literature about this, there are two books that are really wonderful. One is Whitmer Stone's Flora of Southern New Jersey, published in 1910, and then Vegetation of the New Jersey Pine Barrens by John Harshberger in 1915. And there have been other good ones that have come in since then, but those were really seminal works in terms of trying to describe the richness of the flora there. Okay, well, thank you very much.